Hey y'all, welcome back to Going Deeper, the place where we don't just talk about God, we talk about what God is saying right now. Because let's be real, God is not silent, He's not disconnected from culture headlines or even celebrity drama perhaps. And today we're going there.
The internet has been on fire right now over the Beckham family. The timelines are speculating and everyone suddenly became a therapist overnight. But instead of just sipping the tea, we're asking a different question. What does God reveal about moments like this? Or what is being exposed? Or what patterns are we seeing? And what does it say about family, legacy, identity, or the pressure in today's world?
So, if you came for gossip, stay. If you came for discernment, stay even longer. So, let's talk Beckham family drama through heaven's lens.
So for anyone who hasn't been deep in the comment section, here is what has been happening, at least what's been publicly observed. The Beckham family, David and Victoria Beckham, and their kids have long been viewed as this polished, iconic family brand, stylish, successful, united, and even almost untouchable. But Brooklyn Beckham himself, the oldest of the four, broke his silence recently in a series of Instagram posts where he laid out his side of what's been going on. And these weren't casual comments. They were pretty detailed, they were personal, and pretty intense. And to be honest, we've heard tension between Brooklyn's wife and parents before. But Brooklyn Beckham himself, the oldest of the four, broke his silence in a series of Instagram story posts where he laid out his side of what's been going on. And these weren't really casual comments. They were detailed, they were personal, and they were even pretty intense. And to be honest, we've heard of tension before between Brooklyn's wife and his family, but he finally broke silent recently. And I'm going to have Tamar read out some of the things that he said on his story.
He said things like he's been silent for years trying to keep family matters private, but felt pushed to speak out because of continued press narratives. He declared, "I do not want to reconcile with my family," saying he's not being controlled by his wife and that he's standing up for himself for the first time in his life. He accused his parents of controlling how the family story was told to the world, prioritizing public image and shaping performative social media and public events. Brooklyn claimed his parents tried to repeatedly to interfere with his marriage to his wife, Nicola, including allegedly canceling her wedding dress design at the last minute, and other wedding-related conflicts, such as Victoria dancing inappropriately with her son. He said that since he started standing up for himself, he faced attacks sent to the press and even alleged that his siblings were directed to block or unfollow him online. And once Brooklyn spoke up, the conversation absolutely exploded online, because almost immediately people picked sides.
A large group of people feel like Brooklyn is acting like a spoiled kid, someone who grew up with extreme privilege, opportunity, and access, and now wants to distance himself from the very legacy that made his life possible. Some say he doesn't know who he is yet, and that he jumps from passion to passion, and that his public break feels like less like healing and more like proving that he's different. On the other side, people are saying, no, this is a grown man finally standing up for himself and his wife, that marriage changes priorities, and that sometimes separation is the cost of growth. And then there's the layer that makes this story feel very familiar to a lot of people, because many are comparing the situation to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The themes almost feel identical, which speak on legacy versus individuality, family systems versus new marriage, and public image versus personal truth. People are also questioning David and Victoria's role. Some say they're simply trying to guard the legacy they've built just to protect their son from making decisions that could damage him on the long run, and advise him to marry someone genuine who won't sabotage his legacy or his fame. And then there's Nicola. A lot of online voices have brought her up, her past relationships, accusing her of clout chasing, saying her acting career hasn't taken off the way she hoped, and suggesting that marrying into the Beckham name gave her access to the fame she couldn't achieve on her own, even though her family is pretty much already a billionaire level wealthy. None of this has been proven, but the opinions are loud. And what's striking is that people aren't just reacting emotionally, they're protecting their own beliefs about family, marriage, loyalty, and ambition onto the story.
And this is where we pause, because God is able to always speak through these events. This isn't just about the Beckhams. This is about what happens when a family built on image meets the reality of individual growth. And the question isn't who's right. The question is, what is God highlighting right now in this moment for us? Because the internet has already decided to argue that endlessly.
So right now we're living in a time where legacy is being questioned, where younger generations are challenging systems that once felt untouchable, where marriage is forcing people to confront family dynamics they were taught to tolerate instead of heal. This story in particular is showing us the tension between protection and control, between wisdom and fear, between honoring your parents or even forming a new covenant. Whether this ends in reconciliation or permanent distance, one thing is clear and could be a possibility in this event. When God starts shifting identities, relationships get tested. Not because God loves division, but because truth disrupts systems built on image. And maybe that's the real question for us. Where are we protecting legacy at the cost of relationships? What are we calling control love? And where might God be inviting us to choose humility, discernment, and grace even when the situation is messy?
And we're seeing themes of separation, redefining, and loyalty, and choosing obedience over approval. Not just in celebrity families, but everywhere right now. And this is exactly why we keep saying the question is not who's right. So instead of asking which side you're on, maybe ask which part of the story God is using to get your attention.
As I was thinking about this week's episode and the whole Beckham family drama and what to say, I kept reflecting on a book God recently instructed me to read, which is Song of Songs. It's such an interesting book because on the surface, we usually think of it as a poetic reflection of the relationship between God, the Son, and us, his church. But if you look closely, these are actually romantic conversations between a man and a woman. That being said, what's amazing is how the Holy Spirit uses those personal, intimate experiences and moments to reveal much more like glimpse of Christ's heart towards us, and also insights into the relationship and dynamics we all experience. So the verse that I wanted to bring out to the table today, and particularly stood out to me for this episode, is Songs of Songs 2:15, which I'm gonna look for and read because I don't have it up yet. It says, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom." This is a part where a dialogue between the lovers, where they're talking about protecting the beauty of their relationship, this vineyard that they're nurturing together. So note, this is what I got. Vineyards represent relationships. When I meditated on this verse, and historically, even small foxes could cause big damage to young vines destroying the very thing that was just starting to grow and flourish. So when I was meditating, I saw these little foxes as a symbolic of the small, seemingly insignificant problems that can quietly sabotage your relationship, like careless habits, misunderstanding, subtle jealousies, impatience, poor communication, and outside influences. These aren't the big glaring betrayals or fights. They're the small things people often ignore because they seem minor or harmless. But the warning here is clear. It's the little things that can ruin something beautiful when it's unaddressed. That word little stood out to me because it reminds us that these aren't obvious massive issues, but subtle creeping ones, and those are the hardest to notice and sometimes the hardest to fix. So, reading all of this, I felt like this was a direct call to protect what God is cultivating in families and what He does and starts once a family is formed. Because family isn't just about who's related by blood or by marriage. It's about a spiritual system God intentionally designed where we are placed in families to help each other grow, to bring out the best of one another, and to complete a purpose that's bigger than ourselves. To live this all out, this requires humility, patience, being slow to anger, not just reacting, but responding in a way that honors God's greater plan. But here's the truth. In order to be able to do this and achieve this successfully, it takes willpower. It takes a decision to say, family is important. I'm going to fix this, even if it's hard, even if I don't feel like it's fair, or even if I feel like it's one-sided. Because both sides have to come to a place of revelation and importance, reconciliation. And through it all, we have to be like Christ-like. Even when it doesn't make sense, even when you feel hurt or misunderstood, even when I think I deserve better, Christ is our ultimate example. His love never abandons, He never gives up on His intentions, and calls us to keep walking to a path no matter how difficult it is. So when I see stories like the Beckham family, or honestly any family struggles, I'm reminded that God is inviting us to catch these little foxes before they destroy the vineyard that He's carefully planted in our lives and in our homes. But the question comes, how do I deal with this difficulty? Do I just suck it up even if I feel like I deserve better? I don't think so. Because that's exactly why we have Christ. He said things will be difficult, the reality, but He also said we come to Him because His yoke is easy and His burden is light. So I want to read a verse that's Matthew 11:28 through 30. Let me come to it again. It says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." What this verse means is that Christ shows us the way. He walks us through the hard times, carries what we cannot, and gives us strength to love even when it doesn't make sense, because He knows exactly how you feel because He's felt it before first. So when family relationships or life gets messy, don't just try to tough it out alone. Just go to Christ. Let Him lead you in protecting the vineyard, your family, your heart, your calling.
When drama like this happens online, it is very hard to believe and know who is right and who is wrong. You can easily fall into reacting without knowing the full story. So nowadays, many truths are being exposed that have been hidden before, and many famous people are influenced or even controlled through money or threats, which I believe is a very dangerous place to be in your life because we lose authority over our lives. And God tells us that we have full authority over heaven and earth. And right now, we don't know 100% the full story, nor the real situation. I'm sure there's still a lot to unpack. And scripture shows us this over and over. When God is exposing the truth, the tension arises because of the consequences to make way for the new and exposing light to the darkness. God wants us out of that darkness. And 1 Corinthians 4:5 says, "Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purpose of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God." Our heart cannot stay hidden. It speaks through your actions and your motive, which is beautiful for the genuine, but exposing for those whose hearts are hardened. Opinions are all around us, and it makes us very hard to choose which sides we want to be on. Was all of this for clout? Was all of this for revenge? Are the Beckhams truly evil? We will never fully know the truth about the situation. Only the Beckhams and God knows. Even if it isn't visible, God is working within the industry, bringing darkness, sin, and secrets to light and saving those who choose to surrender their lives to Him. Sometimes you simply have to trust that God will bring justice to those who are in the wrong. That trust gives me peace and frees me from panic over who is right or wrong in these types of situations.
And I'm going to go a little bit personal here. Honestly, I feel like this word is specifically for me, and I'm taking it deeply for myself because I feel like this year, even though it just started, it's already shifting my perspective, making me lean more on Christ in ways that I haven't done before. Because last year, my household went through turbulence because between my parents, myself, and my relationship, there were these little conflicts that didn't necessarily, I didn't even worry about it at first. And they just kept piling up until finally it just all exploded. And that explosion, it didn't just affect me, it affected my parents, my sister, my relationship for a whole year. What's crazy is that I just sit back and think about that it just took me a whole year to fully accept this word and realize the realization behind it, because honestly, I knew about this. I've been told before, just lean on God. But I don't know, I just would reason and still hold back from this word and just fully take it in. But now, as I align and root myself completely in Christ, I see doors that are opening that just seemed impossible to open. And my situation isn't 100% resolved yet, but it's on the way as long as I lean on Christ and be Christ-like. So, just this week, even, I had a heartfelt conversation with my mom while driving to school. She had told me that she had planned to talk to me about what happened, and how I was feeling, and just an update. But I wasn't, but she wasn't sure. She thought even that, I'm gonna ask to talk to her. I'm gonna talk to her later, or when is the right time, or I'm gonna wait for a quiet moment to get her and talk about this. And as she was saying and sharing that to me, it had made me realize something important, that a healthy relationship doesn't always need pre-planned conversations or just thinking about what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it. And because of that, I noticed that my trust wasn't fully there, and maybe hers wasn't either, because if she fully trusted me, she wouldn't have pre-planned talking to me or just thought out how will I say it. And if I fully trusted her, I wouldn't have waited days to share what I felt. I would have just said it during a car ride or doing laundry with her, which wanting to share how I feel. I was actually thinking about it for days. But I ended up pushing myself for something more casual, and it was just a car ride. I just needed to trust. But that conversation, it was honestly really lovely, because I think after that, all it's going to take for me is to trust, is just to speak normally and spontaneously, and for her to do the same thing. Just be open with one another. And thinking about this, I just think, wow, this is to think about sharing vineyards, like how I shared previously. We all have vineyards in our lives, and it takes both sides, and they're caring for us to keep them flourishing. Like I share a vineyard with my mom. I share a vineyard with my sister, and with every person that's dear to me. And it's a beautiful way to think of, just to take care of the vineyards that I have with other people.
And with all of that said, this conversation does not end here, because we can reflect, we can discern, we can share our hearts. But there's also so much wisdom that comes from people who walk with families every single day. So we don't just want to leave this theory or opinion here. We wanted to bring in someone who lives in this space professionally and spiritually.
Which is why, coming up next, Christina and I, we sat down with a licensed counselor and a child and family therapist, Mateo Arenas. He's someone who not only understands family systems and conflicts from a clinical standpoint, but also approaches it through a Christ-centered lens. So we asked him the real questions about family, communication, generational patterns, and what healing actually looks like when faith and counseling meet. So if you're listening and thinking, okay, but how do I navigate this in my life? This next segment is for you. So let's get into it. Hey guys, welcome back to the second part of the episode. Today, Christina and I are sitting down to interview Mateo Arenas, who is an associate's licensed therapist, and we have a few questions for him. So let's get started.
Hi, Mateo. How are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Great. So, like Alva said, we have a couple questions for you. And one of our first questions is, as a therapist, what family struggles or conflicts do you see in everyday families that also show up in high-profile ones?
One of the things that we have to kind of take into account is that a family is basically a kind of a composite or a collage of different ideas, different people, different experiences. And the big difference between, I guess, regular families as opposed to families who are high profile, famous, and have a lot of kind of, famous, are in the public eye. I think the big difference is kind of the pressure to maintain an image, right? So the same dynamics that you see in a family at home, whether it's, kids being disobedient or not knowing how to regulate when they're really young, or, conflicts and whatever it might be. It's the same thing that happens in high profile ones. However, there's a lot of eyes, right? So everything seems to kind of be kind of intensified too, right? So, I think that kind of answers the question.
That was an awesome answer, by the way. That's, and connecting with that, we have another question. How does pressure to protect a family's image impact a person's sense of identity, especially in high-profile families?
It's very interesting when it comes to a sense of identity, particularly for kids, right? And if we're talking about the kids of people who grew up in the kind of the limelight, they also have the family's reputation and the family's reputation and the kind of pressure to show the image of the family to the world, right? In particular, when we're talking about the Beckham family, they are kind of like a national treasure, right, for Great Britain, because Victoria is very famous for her role in the Spice Girls, and David is huge in when it comes to soccer and all of this. Both of them are born and raised in England, and so they're kind of, I guess, after the royal family, they're as up there for how famous and how endeared they are by the population. So that in and of itself carries a lot of weight and a lot of pressure for them to, show that they are perfect and everything is good, that they're a happy family. But just like any other family, there's conflicts and there's issues that arise. And if Jesus is not really in the middle of it, right, and what doesn't matter if you're famous or not famous, things will fall apart, right? And it's kind of what we see here, right? And pressure becomes not only something that that's like a weight that you have on there, but when it comes to your identity, you can get really lost in kind of a fabricated image of who you're supposed to be and not really understanding who you are as a person. And that can create a lot of conflict, internal conflict with the person, yeah, whether it's the kid, their children, or even yourself. After years of being famous, it's kind of difficult, or it's kind of easy to kind of lose yourself too.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but basically, yeah, you're right. I think every family does face challenges, even if it's with fame or with not fame. People go through the same thing. But this one question is, how does fame change the power dynamic between parents and their adult children?
That's a really good question. When it comes to power dynamics, I think it really boils down to what foundation was laid when they were kids. What foundation did the parents lay when it comes to how they relate to each other? What expectations to put out there for fame? One of the things that we see a lot with kids who are born into fame is the idea of nepotism, right? And it kind of creates a path forward for them to be equally as famous, or that's why we see so many kids who grow up to kind of follow in their parents' footsteps when it comes to fame, right, and to being out there. But when it comes to power dynamics, because my assumption would be that in many cases when there is kind of you're so used to making sure that your image is presented in a kind of like every aspect of your image when it comes to what you do, what your family looks like, how you're presented to the masses and to people, and how you talk and what you say. You make a conscious and sometimes maybe a subconscious effort to kind of control the kind of the narrative around your family. And as kids, as the kids grow up, it's easy for them to feel kind of that feeling of kind of control, right? And that they need to break out of that somehow, right? And we kind of see that when it comes to kind of the big statement, right, that that their son kind of put out there about feeling like he was being controlled, right? And that he was kind of taking back control. And part of that was you could really see kind of a power dynamic there between him and his feeling of maybe injustice or lack of autonomy with his parents. So that doesn't have to be the case, but we oftentimes see it in families that are kind of famous and things like that, because there is so much pressure to be to present yourself in a specific way, and particularly this family. Again, like I was saying, they are kind of the representation of the British family, right? After the royal family, so I can only imagine the amount of pressure and having to hide and not really deal with a lot of conflicts in the home, which then when kids grow up, boom, you get something kind of like that, right?
Yeah, but I understand your answer, because I was also thinking this morning, wow, like so many kids who were born into fame, either they rebel against their parents or they struggle in finding their own thing. And I think we saw that with Brooklyn, how many people have had opinions that saying that he jumped from passion to passion, like not knowing what to do. So I think that's one of the issues here.
So, shifting gears a little bit, what mistakes do parents often make when a new spouse is introduced into the family system?
That's an interesting question. It's not one that we generally kind of think about, but I think a common kind of issue is expecting the new spouse to kind of work into, or expecting them to behave or to participate in the same way that the family does in their dynamics, when it comes to kind of celebrations or how they relate to each other. There is a natural way of kind of assimilating into a new family, and oftentimes there are expectations that are unsaid, both from the new spouse and also from kind of the family that is accepting the new spouse, right? One interesting thing when I was reading Brooklyn's kind of statement from kind of this dynamic, it seemed like a lot of the things that he was saying was pointed towards his mom, and saying that his mom was kind of very controlling. Which makes me, I guess, like as a therapist, naturally, where I kind of think is that oftentimes when we try to kind of break away from some sort of dynamic of being either controlled or maybe abused, it's very common for people to end up in similar situations where you're also being abused or controlled. So a natural question that I had was, how much of the words and statements that Brooklyn was saying was actually coming from himself, and how much of that was coming from his new wife, right? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a question to ask. And if in reality, him taking kind of back control from kind of the narrative and his family, what actually is happening is him just jumping from one controlling person, which is his mom, into another person, which might be his wife, right? I'm not sure. I don't really know much about his wife or their dynamics or things like that, but you can clearly see in the statement that he made that a big point of contention for the family is the new wife, right? That's the Brooklyn's wife, and marriage, and the dynamic and family, and what that looks like for them.
That's a really good answer that most of us don't think about as as a therapist.
Yeah.
It does really make you think and realize, wow, people do fall into what they're used to. And that connects to my next question, and is, why do in-law relationships often become pressure points in family conflict?
Generally, what I would assume, I'm not too well versed when it comes to this kind of dynamic. I've had a really good experience with my in-laws, and my wife seems to have a really good experience with hers as well, my mom. But I think it really, really boils down to what kind of relationship the person who is getting married has, or I guess both, with their parents, right? And how does that kind of look like in the terms of a new marriage and a new relationship, right? Oftentimes, for example, if a man or a boy grows up to be kind of like a mama's boy, naturally, when he gets married, there is a point of jealousy from the mom, right? Because it feels like they are kind of leaving. Kind of the mom feels like there's a void that's happening, or that's being kind of removed from her heart, basically, and now the person that's doing that is the new wife, right? So generally there is a sense of loss, right? And that can bring a lot of tension. but at the same time, it's understanding that there's this new person that's coming into the family who has a vastly different experience in life, right? Comes from a different household, that they celebrated things differently. They maybe ate meals different in a different way. They resolved issues in a different way. They didn't have the same conflicts that this other family had. So there's so many different dynamics um, that are coming into play here that can kind of exacerbate issues if they're not really if there are already issues. I generally think that when someone gets married, whatever problems there are individually with each person that's getting married in the relationship, and whatever problems the families have too, they're not necessarily going to get resolved. What it's going to do is just kind of highlight and ramp up the problems, right? And these types of relationships kind of bring that to light. So I think that's really important to keep in mind is, do I have things resolved? Am I avoiding the issue, or am I resolving things with my family, right? That's why it's so important to resolve your own issues before going into a relationship, right? You're saving yourself and your family kind of a world of trouble.
That was so insightful. And it's wonderful coming from you, me knowing your wife and your family, how well the cultures have blended together. Because even though it's both Latin cultures, Colombian culture and Venezuelan culture is very different, and it's beautiful just to see how you guys have managed to take all the problems that maybe your families have had and work together to fix them, and build a life for your family to continue to heal and be healed.
Christians often hear honor your parents, but how does that coexist with having healthy boundaries between the kid and the parent?
Well, when it comes to boundaries in the context of a healthy relationship, it is very important to make sure that those things are being established. I work with a lot of parents and a lot of kids, and one thing that I find very very interesting is a lot of times parents are they don't really understand the difference between discipline and punishment, and um, a lot of parents believe that punishment is something that you implement immediately when a child doesn't do what you want them to do. And on the flip side, they think that discipline is the exact same thing as punishment. And a lot of parents grew up with parents resorting to punishment and corporal punishment, like getting a spanking, or or getting hit with a switch or a belt or something like that. And to an extent, that didn't necessarily. I mean, to some people they say, well, I turned out fine, right? But the research now says that corporal punishment might not necessarily be the best kind of course of action. So you have two kind of sets of beliefs here when it comes to parenting, and one of them is the belief that, okay, well, if I want my child to change a behavior, I'm going to immediately punish them, and that's the way to do it. And then you have on the other hand, where parents were like, well, I don't want to inflict harm on my child, and I don't want to. Maybe I'm messing them up by punish them physically, so they just go the other way and they don't really discipline their kids, right? So a good rule of thumb when it comes to kind of limits and boundaries, which is something really important to establish really early on, is understanding that to implement discipline regularly, and punishment as a kind of a last resort. And the difference between the two is the end goal for discipline is connection, right? And punishment is actually the opposite of that, is disconnection. So to kind of answer your question, I know this is kind of long-winded, but as parents, when you establish limits, boundaries, right, that brings a sense of safety and security for a child, right? Expectations. What happens if I do this? What happens if I don't do this? And following through with consequences and all of that. Not being overly permissive when it comes to boundaries and limits, but also not swinging the other way and being someone who is kind of authoritarian or just constantly punishing their kids. By being this way, by implementing discipline, with that which goal is to connect, rather than resorting to punishment every time a child does something wrong, you're automatically setting their child up for clear expectations for when they are an adult, right? When a parent is overly permissive, a child will learn to kind of test boundaries, right? And that it'll show up in school. It'll show up sometimes maybe with the law, right? So that's kind of the first part, I guess, of my answer. But also, establishing boundaries and limits in a relationship, in any relationship, not just with kids, but between spouses or with friends, is something super important because one, you're honoring yourself and you're also honoring the other person, right? Setting limits and boundaries is kind of the line that we don't cross, right? Out of respect, out of caring for the other person. And setting boundaries is not necessarily something bad. And a lot of times we feel like, oh, setting a limit for someone or setting a boundary for someone, it feels like you're being mean or that you just allow, that is something mean or something you shouldn't do. So let's not do it, right? So let's not put in kind of a boundary or a limit. But when you don't do that, basically you're allowing that other person to do anything that they want or that they should do, and that's harming the other person, right? And as well as harming yourself. So when it comes to limits and boundaries, it's important to establish them in any relationship, and having clear expectations. What is expected in my relationship with you? And just because you are my grandparent, just because you are my father, you're my mother, that doesn't mean that you can treat me any kind of way, right? And setting boundaries is making clear expectations. This is what our relationship should look like. Obviously, out of love, with Jesus in the center. I think Jesus is a really good example of what honoring is, right? And what setting limits is as well, right? So yeah, I know that was kind of a kind of big turnaround question, but answer to your question, but yeah.
Wow, that was, I mean, being the age that I am, I had no idea that there was a difference between discipline and punishment. People often use it interchangeably. And so to hear you break it down like that, not only does it help me, as you know, I have two younger siblings, so it helps me understand the difference and also when to use which. Also, about boundaries, that is so important. I feel like sometimes we often, like you said, we often think, oh no, that's mean, we shouldn't do that. Or we think, oh, it's fine, like I can handle it. But no, you shouldn't have to, and those are healthy boundaries that we should establish. So absolutely blew my mind, by the way.
Yeah, and I really agree with Christina and with your answer. I think it's eye-opening just because I think in Latin culture as well, no one talks about boundaries. No one talks about this. They automatically feel like they're being attacked or, oh, well, you just don't want me in your life. And it's not really that. It's because I care for you, we need to have boundaries. We need to take care of this relationship that we have. And yeah, it also made me think about a clip that I saw when you mentioned about Jesus being in the center of it all. Jesus also had boundaries. Like he had boundaries when it came to speaking to multitudes, when he came to speak with his disciples, and then with his closer people like Peter, he talked one-on-one with him. So I think boundaries, it is very crucial and when it comes to taking care of relationships with one another. Okay. So, dealing with family boundaries.
There's also times where people offend each other, and then there's also time to forgive. So, what does biblical forgiveness actually look like in an ongoing family conflict?
That's a good question, and um, I think my answer applies to both, um, uh, kind of in a therapeutic sense, but also my own experience when it comes to forgiveness and what that looks like. A lot of time, people feel like um, forgiveness is justifying or saying that it was okay what that person did to me. And I think that's can be farther from the truth, right? When we are hurt by someone else, or when we are um, there is a conflict, and we are affected in some way. Initially, what we do is we kind of grab some weight, right? And it adds weight to us. And I usually, when I'm talking to people in a therapy session about this, I kind of frame it in a way with, like, imagine like you're grabbing like a trash bag, right? And the trash bag is heavy, and it's full of like things that are smelly or stinky or things like that. And The equivalent of that trash bag could be grudge, could be pain, could be disappointment, could be shame, could be guilt, could be a lot of things, right? And all of those things come when you don't forgive and you continue having conflict. Um, and a lot of times people go through their life, and particularly also in kind of the relationship with the family, they go through their life carrying this weight, carrying this trash bag. And you go to them and you're like, well, the way to kind of get rid of this weight is to forgive. And the more someone is mm, kind of either told to forgive, or when that option kind of pops up, they just hold tighter to the bag, right, and not want to let it go. But the truth is that forgiveness is not justifying what that person did to you that was right. Is saying forgiveness, and true what it is despite the fact that this person did to me, even though that they hurt me, even though they disappointed me, even though they affected me, and a lot of times maybe traumatized me, um, I decide to let it go. I decide to not seek retribution. I decide not to seek justice, right? And in the Christian context, it's also deciding to give it up to Christ, right? And telling yourself that ultimately you know that who is going to bring justice, whatever that might look like, and not is going to be Christ, and not you demanding it anymore, right? Um, However, going back to your previous question, when it comes to this topic specifically, um, I think we're all called to forgive, right? If Jesus forgave all of us, then the least we can do is forgive anybody who wrongs us. Easier said than done. But that doesn't mean that when we forgive someone, that means that we're just going to open the door wide open so they can come hurt us again. That's not the case. And that's why we establish limits and boundaries. If there's someone who is in your family who is extremely toxic, for example, and every time you visit them or every time you talk to them, all that spews out of their mouth is venom or poison, and they've hurt you, your role is to forgive them. But over time, it naturally is still loving that person, however that might look like for you, but also not putting yourself in a situation where you're going to be continuously hurt until that person changes, or that person, God does something in the life of that person. Completely shutting your heart away, though, and not wanting there to be any future reconciliation with that person, or not wanting the relationship to be fixed because of what they've done, then that shows there's no true forgiveness, right? So there's two things that is happening there. One, the person that was hurt, you need to forgive. Um, Establish limits and boundaries is healthy, especially with dealing with someone who um, is toxic, or is someone who is going to hurt you, but also being open for future reconciliation. And if that person changes, then cautiously opening your doors again, right, to bring that person back into your life. So that's kind of my 2 cents when it comes to kind of forgiveness and all of that.
Okay, so can forgiveness be I forgive you, but then sometimes still feel can you circle back to the emotions, or that's not full forgiveness?
That's a good question. I think when it comes to forgiveness, um, I think I think it is a process. I think it is important to one of the things that I kind of help my clients with is really identifying what emotion is driving you to do something, right? And if you've made so so there needs to be that process of kind of healing and making sure that the emotions that you have um, are, are healed and you're going through the process. Doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven, um, because that's kind of more of a, like a logical or kind of psychological thing that happens in your mind, but the emotion sides behind it, and the disappointment that you might feel or the hurt, that's something that you have to kind of process and get to kind of a sense of closure to.
Okay, so kind of closing. We have two more questions, but kind of headed towards closing. If someone sees their own family in a similar situation, what are steps they can take towards healing?
I think the first step towards healing, specifically if we're like looking at the whole Beckham situation, versus Jesus, right? If Jesus is in the center, like the Bible says, everything else will come afterwards, right? Put the kingdom first, and everything else will follow. But more of like practical steps, there needs to be a sense of um, feeling that what part do I play in this issue, and how can I change, rather than looking at the other person or pointing fingers, right? Is making sure that you are trying to understand what part you're playing and what dynamic you need to change in order for the whole dynamic of the family to change. If every person's able to do that, then the resolving the issue and coming from a place of humility rather than pointing fingers, um, there's more of a chance of resolution.
So moving on to the last question, what is your opinion on what does a healthy faith-centered family actually look like when conflict shows up? Like what's a good example of how to treat it?
Like I was saying, putting Jesus in the center, and by doing that, it could be through praying or, making sure that there is an atmosphere where he is welcome into the conflict or the problem, but also understanding that giving the other person or people in the conflict the benefit of the doubt is one, right? Being open to forgive, right? Letting go of being right, right? One of the biggest things that leads to conflict is our sense of right, what's right and what's wrong, and if we're right or someone else wrong. But also, there are a lot of times when there's conflict when we are right and the other person is wrong. But there is a sense of sacrifice that needs to be made even when you are right, right? Um, and the biggest example of that is Jesus, right? He had a ton of things that um, he never committed any sin. He never did anything wrong. Despite that, he gave up his rights and committed went through the ultimate sacrifice for us. So whenever we feel in a conflict or even outside of the conflict, we're in our rights, when we're in the space to demand something, it's really important for us to kind of check ourselves and see if we are acting like Jesus in that moment. So I guess to boil down the answer is putting Jesus as the primary example in the resolution of conflicts. How did he manage conflicts, and how did he resolve the ultimate conflict, which was sin, right? And that was through sacrifice and humility. If we're willing to bring sacrifice and humility in a family conflict, then there can the only outcome of that and the end of that is a Christ-centered solution. It's peace, love.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you for all the insight, the wonderful advice that you've given. And also, thanks for uniting or for showing us how psychology, Christ culture and pop culture can all come together to see for the bigger picture. And thank you guys for going deeper with us on the Going Deeper podcast. Bye.